Hi, I'm Father David Gerritsen. I'm an international representative with the IATSE, the Stagehands Union, and a proud board member of the Event Safety Alliance. I want to welcome you to this virtual safety summit and look forward to seeing each and every one of you either on a job site in the near future or at our next live event. The ESA is a unique venue where people from all aspects of our industry, from the acts, the production managers, the equipment vendors, the insurance carriers, the weather and safety consultants, and crowd consultants, meet together to share ideas and build a culture of collaboration. This culture is not simply one of job site safety, but career safety, career dignity, sustainable economic models where people can have a lifelong career creating the magic that we as live event workers create for our audiences, our clients, and everyone that we work with on the job site. I encourage you to become a part of this movement to help create a culture of inclusion, sustainability, economic growth, and safety. Again, I look forward to seeing you in person. Have a good show. Be safe. God bless and keep you.
Well, thank you, Father Dave, and welcome back to Event Safety TV. I do love the logo. I think that's really cool. I hope you're enjoying that. For this session, I am delighted to be having a conversation live, because we're actually coming to you live, with a new friend who I think is going to be a lot of fun, as well as incredibly interesting and insightful. The sort of brain power that we aspire to be surrounded by with the Event Safety Alliance. And, this is a stroke of good fortune because I have been on several panels during the pandemic with Jessica Malaty Rivera. And each time she dazzles me with some insight that is just completely beyond anything that I thought about before. So for this session, I'm going to chat with infectious disease epidemiologist and science communicator, a combination I can't even imagine, because it is so necessary for these times. And so Jessica Malaty Rivera and I are going to talk about science and communicating science and letting our views be guided by reality, and even how to talk to other people about that reality as we go back to work, as we travel, and as the times throw us new curveballs, which is what Jessica and I were just talking about. So, Jessica Malaty Rivera, thank you for joining us. And what's new?
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Steve, and thanks for having me. I'm very delighted to be speaking to you all today. There's a lot that's new, and if we want to just jump right into the deep end here, I'm sure lots of people's minds are on this new emerged variant called Omicron. And I have lost quite a bit of sleep myself trying to make sense out of the dizzying headlines. But I do want to say that the biggest takeaway from all of the headlines, from all of the tweets, and from all of the coverage on your cable news networks, is that the unknowns here really do outweigh the knowns, and that there's something a bit comforting in the fact that this is pretty expected, in that viruses mutate. They mutate all the time. And we still have a lot of people around the world who are unvaccinated and a lot of virus circulating. And those combination of variables creates the perfect storm for a newly emerged variant. Now, we should have some pretty big answers to some pretty big questions in the next days and weeks with regard to things like transmissibility, severity of disease, and even the effectiveness of the vaccines. But as of today, December 1st, 2021, our vaccines are still safe, very effective, and one of the best tools in our toolkit to keep us all safe and moving forward towards the holidays.
Now, Jessica, you just said a whole bunch of things that are really important. So let's slow this action down and get you properly credentialed. Tell us, what does an epidemiologist do? And how do you know the important things that you just told us?
Yeah, happy to share that. So my background is pretty specific to the reality that we're all living in right now. I have my undergraduate degree in public health and my graduate degree in emerging infectious diseases. While I was in graduate school at Georgetown, I actually worked on a government-funded project that was specifically intended to identify indicators and warnings of emerging epidemics and pandemics. So I have been breathing and drinking and reading and dreaming about this reality for at least the last 15 to 20 years. And I will say that many people in my field were not surprised by the emergence of COVID-19. In fact, it was always a matter of when, not if, because we understand the evolution of things like diseases that happen in animals and in human species that kind of clash as their ecosystems become closer and closer. As an epidemiologist, what that means is I spend a lot of time looking at numbers, statistics, and charts. And essentially what I'm trying to do is make sense of what's happening on a biological perspective in our population. So understanding things like rates, transmission, cases, hospitalizations, deaths, and putting that in context of what that means for our policies that influence the things we do to protect ourselves as a community. Public health is kind of a thankless job in the sense that it works when it's invisible. And right now we're kind of dealing with the consequence of not valuing public health for a long time and now catching up after devaluing it for so long. Throughout the pandemic, I actually worked with the COVID tracking project, which kind of emerged as a rogue CDC when the outbreak first was identified in March of 2020. So I have been intimately close with case counts and how the virus is moving in our population since day one. In fact, I think it was December 29th of 2019 when I got my first email about this undifferentiated pneumonia-like flu that was reported in Wuhan. So it's been a minute since I have been working on this.
I note that I didn't receive an email from you back in December 2019 giving me a heads up. We'll discuss that later, perhaps.
Yeah.
So you make an interesting observation that public health is not something that is generally noticed until stuff goes sideways. I suspect that every event professional who deals with back of house operations who's watching this conversation was nodding like a bobblehead, empathizing. So yes, we feel your pain. We don't like being outed either. So as we sit here on December 1, 2021, is there any good news?
There's a lot of good news. I think it's very easy to look at the statistics, and I spend all my days looking at the statistics and feel overwhelmed and feel like things are not moving in the right direction. But we are moving towards a more vaccinated population. The vaccines continue to provide the best protection against hospitalization and death. And let's just go ahead and say, in the history of vaccines, that is the primary goal of all vaccines. So the fact that these vaccines are doing a great job of keeping people out of hospital beds and alive is a great thing to be comforted by. Not to mention the fact that now we have eligibility for 30 million people in the United States between the ages of 5 and 11. That's going to be a game changer for how disrupted all of our lives were with the school closures, with people having to work from home with children. And so hopefully the inclusion of this demographic is going to help us all get closer to the end. Pandemics don't last forever, but pandemics don't finish quickly. And so I just want to contextualize that we are definitely in a marathon. We're in that painful part where it's mind over matter, and we'll get to the end eventually.
One of the issues, so now I'm segueing from talking about the science itself to communicating the science, which is, the other really fascinating hat that I know you wear. When we were prepping for this, we were making jokes about things that have been established in the science world, but which are still contested out in the world of social media, in sports, in other realms. And at the time, Green Bay Packers quarterback Aaron Rodgers was the obvious punching bag or lightning rod, whatever analogy you wish to use. And so we contemplated having a game basically called Why Aaron Rodgers is Wrong. And so can we go through, Jessica, can we go through some of the established science, which in some quarters is still contested, so that our viewers understand the arguments that they can confidently make to their peers about why they should be vaccinated?
Happily. So I'll start by saying one of the biggest misconceptions is the science behind or the technology behind these vaccines and how they actually work. I've been in this space for a very long time, and I've specifically worked on vaccine research, understanding kind of the different mechanisms of action, what they're made of, what they're not made of, what they do in your body, how long they're in your body, etc. mRNA is truly one of the most remarkable milestones we've made in our public health arsenal of things to help us kind of stay alive as a human species. With regard to mRNA vaccine, it's actually been around for 3 decades. And in the context of human use in vaccines for 2 decades. So while people haven't maybe heard of it, because obviously we've got the kind of biases of what's in our bubbles and what's not in our bubbles. This is very much my bubble. I was not surprised to see that this was going to be the modality to get this type of vaccine done, because it's cheap, very easily produced, and it's extremely targeted. Now, when you're dealing with a global health emergency like a newly emerged virus, you want to get as specific as possible, as safely as possible, and as effectively as possible. Those are the goals when you create a new vaccine. So the theories of it being new, of it being too experimental, or of it altering your body because you hear something that sounds like genetic material and your body and your brain immediately jumps to conclusions like DNA and DNA changing your body's makeup. Those are all, unfortunately, the consequences of people not understanding the science or really understanding the context of a longly paved runway to get to this point that we're into today.
So I'm making notes, not new, which explains, at least in my mind, why vaccines were available so quickly from something that, it is COVID-19. It's not like it's been around forever, at least not that particular variety. So not new, and does not alter your DNA, doesn't change who you are.
Nope. And I'll say, this again shows my bias of my proximity to biology. And many people are not expected to remember this part of your, intro to bio from high school. But the direction of how information is translated in your body goes RNA to proteins. It doesn't go RNA to DNA. So all the body is doing is translating that message into the spike protein and giving your body kind of like a cheat sheet to say, hey, look out for this guy, this spike protein on this SARS-CoV-2 virus. If it comes through, fight it. But our DNA is actually safely encapsulated in the nucleus of our cells, has nothing to do with the RNA, and doesn't even get close to it.
So I'm just going to say it again because I'm an arts and humanities guy. None of the vaccines, not Pfizer, not Moderna, not Johnson & Johnson, none of them will change my DNA. The essence of who fabulous Steve Adelman is, that's all cool no matter how many booster shots I get?
Biologically impossible.
Okay, I will check off that concern from my Aaron Rodgers list. How about people who are either pregnant, nursing, or contemplating getting pregnant? What should they be thinking about?
Yeah. So as somebody who's been in this space for a long time, I will say that there is a known playbook from the anti-vax movement that has some talking points that are often regurgitated when a new therapeutic or vaccine is on the market. The claims of causing impaired fertility or, harmed fertility or any sort of effect on reproductive health in general with regard to organs and production of reproductive fluids are all copy pasted from the anti-vaccine playbook. There is no biological plausibility to show that this would happen. In fact, if we go back to the earliest stages of these clinical trials, while people were encouraged to not conceive, people got pregnant because people get pregnant, even in the context of clinical trials. And among the outcomes with regard to who was in those trials, the worst outcomes happened among the placebo group. Those who did not actually get the vaccine and did not have that protection against SARS-CoV-2, those who were in the vaccine arm ended up having the best outcomes for maternal and fetal health. Since then, there have been hundreds of thousands of people who have been willfully vaccinated as they are trying to conceive, as they've conceived, and as they've had live births, that have shown not only a detection of very protective antibodies for mom and baby, but also the fact that they were the ones that were likely not hospitalized, not put on breathing machines, not having to be on supportive care in any way, and made it full term. We have seen a very, very scary trend of pregnant people suffering some of the worst outcomes because pregnant people are considered immunocompromised and you are in a very fragile state. So it is not only something that is available to pregnant people or people trying to get pregnant, it is actually strongly encouraged by every regulatory body between CDC, FDA, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the American Academy of Pediatrics with regard to fetal care, and every other group in between that has an opinion on these sorts of health outcomes.
Now, I know from reading, because I'm a nerd and I like sports, unlike some of our executive committee who did not know about Duke basketball. Shame on you people. I know that you actually had some significant involvement speaking to a group of athletes who had very good reason to be concerned, to have questions, and you wound up being a trusted messenger for health information earlier in the pandemic. Jessica, would you tell us about your involvement with the Wnba?
Happily. Yeah. So early in the pandemic, I was reached out by the head of the Wnba to be part of a panel of trusted experts to help kind of answer questions in a very intimate, judgment-free setting. Every question you can imagine that some of the players had with regard to the safety, the background, the issues of pregnancy and fertility health, and spent a couple hours with the players and the union members and some of the management there to make sure that there were no, rocks unturned, that everything that could possibly be talked about was talked about in a very safe context. And as a result of these conversations and a lot of very, very faithful diligence on their part, the Wnba is the most vaccinated professional sports league in America. I believe that as of recently, they were 99% vaccinated. And I think as of maybe a few weeks ago, I think they might be at 100%. That is a really, really incredible example of when a company, an entity, an organization, or a group of people prioritize getting good information from trusted sources and act accordingly. And the fact that they did this knowing that a lot of these women are women of color who have a variety of reasons to be distrusting of medical professionals and medical breakthroughs for a variety of historical reasons and current. They brought in a number of us as scientists with similar backgrounds to speak with, very candidly to make sure that they understand that there was humans and not just bots behind the science to explain it to them.
Now, one of the things that I've noticed consistently about the way you present yourself, so now I'm violating a rule by talking about your appearance, you don't wear a white lab coat that has your name stitched on it. You don't look like hi, I'm, the embodiment of science here. Why do you do that?
Yeah, I think that that's one of the reasons why trust is something that I have earned from a lot of my audience. I've definitely spent many, many hours in a lab coat with lab goggles, with lab gloves, with pipettes, getting carpal tunnel syndrome, trying to get my, assays in the correct place. If you know, then you know. There are many, many hours spent lonely in a cold laboratory. But that's not how the science translates, right? There is this common a quote from Sir Mark Walport that says, "Science isn't finished until it's communicated." Science is useless if it's just sitting in a cold laboratory freezer, right? It has to exit those doors and be translated and communicated in a way that is accessible in common language, that's not dumbing it down, but is intended to help equip people to increase their science and data literacy. And even pre-COVID, I have been working from home doing this sort of work, translating the clinical data, which I spent many, many years immersed in, to make it more broadly accessible. Data, even when we think about the COVID-19 data, for so long it has just been on spreadsheets and CSV files on like page 42 of a CDC tab, right? And that doesn't help anybody. Data belongs to people. It should be widely understood. It should be accessible. And I have just taken a great amount of joy in helping show that a person who looks like me, who doesn't have to wear a lab coat or big, thick glasses, can be a scientist who can speak. Mine are in the other room. I just didn't put them on today. Who can speak clearly about what these numbers mean and what it means for everybody's individual life.
So I'm going to speak through the third wall right now. So Event Safety Alliance viewers, you're hearing something which I think is so important and which is a common theme through what a lot of us do. It's important to develop subject matter expertise in whatever is your area. You could be a rigger, you could be hanging lights or, directing people back of house or, even doing the stuff that I do. But communicating it in a way that is accessible to other people who don't have your expertise or your experience, that's what brings your knowledge to life. So Jessica is explaining epidemiology to you. Later today, we're going to learn about meteorology from Dr. Kevin Clazel, who is so good at this. And you sometimes wonder, I call him Kev. I never call him Dr. Clazel. Kev, you look like a normal person. How is it that you are Mr. Science when it comes to severe weather? Jessica, you project the same thing. You are cool. And yet you're using these big science-y words that, arts and humanities kid over here, I'm furiously writing notes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that is one of the most wonderful silver linings of this pandemic, is that it's shown that there's not one way to become a scientist, not one way to be a scientist, or one way to look like a scientist. And I think that, science can even be done when you're in sweatpants on your kitchen counter with your kids screaming in the background, which has been me for a long time in the last year and a half. And I think that it's inviting more people into something that has for many, many years seemed unapproachable, seemed elitist, seemed very white male dominated. And I think that what we're doing now is kind of breaking those stereotypes, showing that there's so many ways to be a scientist, that science needs diversity in types of backgrounds. I mean, some of the best scientists I know became scientists later in life after having experience in arts and humanities, after being doing things completely unrelated, because I think all things in some way have some science to it. And then switching, putting on a different hat. And I want to invite, especially the young folks who are looking at all this, air quote scientists responding to COVID, and know that there's room for you.
Let's follow that thread. There is room for you. Let's talk about so we're back to communications now. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about what our viewers can or should say to people who claim to need an exemption, either for religious reasons or for medical reasons. What can you share on those subjects?
Yeah. So I want to say first that when it comes to responding to misinformation, disinformation, claims of needing an exemption or some sort of unique opinion or situation with regard to complying to mandates or policies, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer, because the audience, the person you're talking to, the people that you're speaking to, are not a monolith. And I think that that is my first reminder to folks, is to listen first, to figure out the context and the reasoning behind these claims and requests for a modified policy for them, because we're dealing with people who have been indoctrinated because they grew up in a household like that. They've had medical trauma or medical, feeling ignored by their providers. They have had, a history of complicated health things that make them weary of new things to them, even if it may not be new to science. So remembering that context is key and listening first is going to help you be a better responder in the situation. Now, all that said, when it comes to things that people claim about allergies, for instance, or that they would have a specifically bad reaction, the answer to that is actually pretty simple, in that even on the CDC's website, it says that there's only one allergy or one allergen that is known to actually justify an exemption for an allergic reaction, and that is having a very specific allergy to a compound called polyethylene glycol, which is the active ingredient in Miralax. Somebody who has that allergy will absolutely know they have that allergy. So to claim allergy is a very easily kind of refuted claim. Now, go ahead.
Let's pause that thought for just a second, because when I discovered that PEG was basically a common household compound, it was quite a revelation to me, and candidly made it a lot easier for me to deal with claims of exemption based on allergic reactions for clients of mine. Because there's actually, you mentioned Miralax. It's all, PEG is also in like hand lotion and baby wipes and other super common things that most people have around their house. So I just wanted to underscore that point before we go past it. If someone asserts to you, viewer of this conversation, if someone asserts to you, I have a medical reason for my exemption request, they would already have known long before the pandemic began that they were allergic to this PEG compound, because it would have been a hazard their entire lives.
Yep. And I will say too, when it comes to some of the most medically fragile folks on this planet, on the whole, they are mostly encouraged to be vaccinated. And I'm talking about some of the most medically fragile people being organ transplant recipients, people on chemotherapy, people who are severely immunocompromised because of chronic illnesses or medication that they're taking intended to suppress their immune system. So even some of the most vulnerable people are being encouraged to be vaccinated because it is that safe and it is that important. Now, when it comes to religious exemptions, this is a very interesting one. Prior to COVID, truly like months before COVID emerged, I worked on a legislation here in California called SB 276 that was intended to, very ironically, make fraud illegal when it came to medical exemptions for vaccination. What had ended up happening was there were a number of doctors, I think air quotes doctors, because I think some of them have had their licenses revoked since this, were basically fraudulently writing exemptions for people to get away with bypassing the requirements for elementary school vaccination records with claims of religious conflict. The list of religious groups that actually have a, opposition to vaccines is incredibly small. We're talking about Christian Scientists, we're talking about Jehovah's Witnesses, and maybe a couple in between of like extreme groups in some of the other sects. When we were seeing statistically that there were school jurisdictions that had 40% compliance to the vaccination requirements, we realized something is going on. Either everybody has converted, mass conversions to these religious groups, or there is some loophole that they're falling into. And we found that there was a loophole. If you look, and I would say this is probably the most compelling thing, a lot of people feel this specific moral obligation to the use of fetal cells. Now, fetal cells are a very common practice in innovations for medicine. In fact, if you were to look at the list of drugs that are probably in every single person on this call's medicine cabinet, I would argue that between 75 and 80% of those drugs have had an origin using fetal cell lines in their preliminary laboratory research, which would say, and some hospitals have actually had to do this, if you oppose taking the COVID-19 vaccine because of its use in lab context of fetal cell lines, you must also sign this form that says that you will no longer take Tylenol, Motrin, Pepcid, Pepto-Bismol. The list goes on and on and on and on, because there is a conflict and a bias there against the vaccine that doesn't actually fall through if you're saying it's for that specific reason. Now, there have been hospital groups in particular that I'm thinking of that have just categorically denied any religious exemption because of that specific thing, because they know that they have to use and or handle these other drugs that have that same history. Now, I'm not saying that you should be in a position to say, well, then you can't take Tylenol. But when it comes to a legitimate medical exemption, again, the actual group that would be specifically prohibited from doing that is exceptionally small and statistically not likely the person right in front of you.
Because I grew up talking like I swallowed a dictionary, I have always faced the peril of just telling someone, what you say is illogical. It does not make sense. You should stop saying that because it makes you sound ignorant. That doesn't go over well, at least not in my experience. Perhaps, Jessica, it goes better for you. But what you just said is super logical, and I suspect doesn't go over particularly well if you just tell somebody, your request for a religious exemption based on this grounds is, to use the legal word, crap or nonsense. It does not add up at all. One of the alternative strategies that I know we have discussed before comes from your friend, my hoped for future friend, Catherine Heo, who talks about climate science and tries to communicate that to people who are deniers of climate change. And one of the things that she emphasizes is finding some common ground, some issue about which the pro-science person agrees with the not so pro-science person. And you find some common ground to agree upon, and that makes you a less judgy person, and that helps get your message through. So
yes,
Jessica, first, does that work for you? And related to that, do you have any of that sort of common ground suggestion for our viewers?
Absolutely. And that's one of the 5 tactics that I often kind of repeat, as far as when people ask me, how can you be an effective science communicator or even effective family member during the holidays, that's not going to throw the cranberry sauce across the table. We're talking about things like I mentioned before, radical listening, right? So really listening and understanding what they're saying, knowing the background, avoiding labels and stigmatizing language, because it's very, very polarizing to call somebody anti-vax or a conspiracy theorist or anti-science. Those are very much binary words that we're trying to avoid here. We're trying to understand and get to common ground. The third thing that I often say is to share personal anecdotes. I very much speak as a woman of color who's had issues of not feeling heard or listened to by my doctors. I speak as a mother who has got 2 young kids, ages 5 and under, who are very, very concerned over the health and well-being of my children. I very much have shared and documented my daughter's experience when she turned 5 years old, right before she was eligible for the vaccine. And she was first in line as soon as it was available to get her first dose. I share those experiences and all the sentiments that kind of got me to that. My anxiety, my fear, my careful reading of 82 pages of data to make sure that I had all the information that I needed. The fourth thing being making sure that you are extending empathy and grace, because without that, you continue to cause more division. And then the other thing is to share reliable sources. I think so many people get sucked into these vortexes of misinformation because their bias sends them to some crunchy something website blog that is trying to sell them something at the end of the day. And helping divert their gaze from the bad to the truth is going to go a long way. And you can actually share common ground there too and say, hey, I read that and it was so confusing, so misleading. I actually had to double check it and triple check it myself because it seemed plausible, and show them these are ways that I have helped make it less confusing. make me feel more confident and make me feel like this was the informed choice for myself and my family. The more opportunities you can show that you also struggled, because I would argue that few things are as disorienting and destabilizing as a global pandemic, much more so than wars, because wars are local, very, very specific to an area. When you're talking about an invisible microbe that can affect anybody with a pulse, that is every person on this planet, and including yourself in the pandemic fatigue, the frustrations of delayed birthdays and weddings and funerals and all the things in between, shows people that you also are a person with a pulse that is deeply affected by this pandemic.
Let me make sure I understand then. So is it not just as good to get all of my science news from Facebook?
Yeah, no.
So they're not, that's not equivalent to like CDC, Facebook? No, really?
No. I will say there was this like hilarious and also painful joke that after Facebook renamed itself to Meta, that people would then therefore say that they have done meta-analysis, which as an epidemiologist makes me want to die. For all the nerds in the room, you get what I'm talking about. But yeah, Facebook is not a reliable source. However, there are reliable messengers who also use Facebook as a place to combat misinformation. I myself have actually jumped into the dumpster fire myself of Instagram to try and combat misinformation and try to front load that stream of content with verifiable data, with reliable sources, because I want that information to go viral as well. I mean, there's this famous, is it a Churchill quote of like, a lie goes around the world before the truth can get its pants on? That's what we're dealing with the proliferation of bad information on social media. But if you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I think there are opportunities to find good news there, but as a category, we should be wary of people who solely get their information from social media.
Let's provide our viewers with someplace healthy to go then. Do you have any sources of reliable data that you trust that you would recommend to our viewers?
So I know that there is, in many ways, in this hyper-politicized world, a bias against the regulatory bodies. So for some people, saying CDC and FDA is going to immediately shut them off. So if you don't want to go to the regulatory agencies' websites, the patient advocacy groups and the groups that represent certain demographics do a wonderful job to provide accessible, real-time information for their cohorts. So when I mentioned the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, ACOG, every single day, they are updating their website with information related to people trying to conceive, people who are pregnant, people who are postpartum. The American Academy of Pediatrics is a wonderful source for people who have children or want to have children and need to understand, what does these 82 pages from Pfizer actually mean for my child? What do these 360,000 pages mean for people who are over 16 for Moderna? So there are patient advocacy groups and networks that I think do a really great job to kind of, not have the government affiliation that some people have a visceral reaction to, and have lay people and also experts behind the scenes providing that kind of information. Now, there's also wonderful folks on Twitter who do very, very amazing experts on Twitter who provide digestible nuggets of truth in the context of threads or Substacks or newsletters. If there are specific topics that you are, I can curate a list for you if you'd like to get more specific in the future. But there are a number of experts, and I think they have become, in many ways, people have even told me, like, on a first name basis when they refer to their virologist that they follow, and they'll cite the recent studies that person was talking about.
Well, you're going to be my smart friend Jessica from now on, so beware. You've already got that status, and yes, I think it would be great if, when we're done, if we can hit you up for a list of social media sources and digestible little nuggets, because not everyone has the time or the inclination to, try to eat the elephant all at once. But yeah, I mean, little tidbits here and there will keep people on the right track as opposed to going down, some rabbit hole. That would be good.
Yeah.
I'm going to conclude with a question that I always struggle with myself when I'm asked about the future. People say, Steve, so what do you see 6 months from now, for the event industry? It's like, I don't know, where's my crystal ball? I guess that's a supply chain delay or something like that. Do you have any clue what we're looking at for? And I'll give you something very specific to aim for. Our event safety summit, so our organization's annual event, was supposed to be right now, starting today. And obviously we're doing this instead. So we kicked it to March 22, 23, and 24. So Jessica, just as far as the pandemic goes, what do you see for late March? Throw us a bone here.
I know. I want that bone myself, believe me. Now, I will say, excuse me, the typical epidemiologist answer, which I've heard you say is also the lawyer's answer, is it depends. It really depends on what we do today, tomorrow, and the coming weeks. So we are well into flu season. We are well into the winter holiday season. As a result, people are gathering indoors, people are traveling more, people are letting their guard down because they're bleeping tired and they want to be with their loved ones. So we have a moment here, kind of a really a fork in the road of if we want to keep hospitalizations and severe cases down. We don't want what happened last winter to happen, because what that'll do is it'll bleed over into the spring of 2022. What we do today has a direct implication on March 2022. I want to say that 2 more times, because it is not what's going to happen then. It's what are we doing now? So the things that we need to focus on now are making sure that everybody is still practicing this additive approach to public health mitigation. Think of it like layers of Swiss cheese. The more layers of Swiss cheese you have in front of each other, the less likely that virus is going to make it through all those holes to the very end. So masking, physical distancing, making sure that you're avoiding as many indoor gatherings as possible, getting your booster shot, getting fully vaccinated first is your most important thing. And if you are eligible to get your booster shot, all of these things are going to be ways in which we buy ourselves more time to get to a place where those two dynamics that I mentioned earlier, high vaccination, low transmission, gets us to that equilibrium where we can have events like yours in March of 2022 with minimal disruptions. Will the pandemic be over in March of 2022? No, I can say that pretty confidently. Will it be like this? It depends. It doesn't have to be, and we have a lot of control now in our hands to make sure that it doesn't happen that way. Now, when we talk about the future of COVID-19 too, I kind of also want to mention the word that I think some people are a little bit squeamish about, but I think should not be considered defeat. You've probably heard the word endemic or endemicity as kind of possible outcomes of this virus. And it's very, very likely that that's where we're headed, meaning that the virus isn't going anywhere, that COVID-19 is probably going to be an annoying gnat in the room for quite some time. But we've dealt with this before. If you remember in 2009, H1N1, the pandemic that really affected kids, that is a regularly circulating flu virus that happens every single year. It's something we've adapted to. It's something that we've formulated our flu vaccines to accommodate. And that's probably what we'll be looking at in the next coming years. It will become less and less disruptive as we become more and more protected as a human species. But again, everything about the future depends on everything that we do today.
Well, I'm gratified that you ended with "it depends," which validates everything that I've been saying for my entire legal career. So thank you for that. Jessica Malaty Rivera, thank you for the epidemiological science wisdom. Thank you for the communication suggestions. This has been incredibly helpful. I hope that all of our viewers have been taking copious notes, because we don't get this kind of messaging often enough. So I'm very grateful. Thank you so much for your time.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm Neil Vasavada, President and CEO of Overdrive Energy Solutions and board member to the Event Safety Alliance. If there's one thing that this last year has taught me, it's that we need live events to escape from this virtual world more than ever. So, thank you for joining us in this mission of keeping live events safe and sustainable.